one important point for this audience, which has now heard several important presentations here today, that we are looking at a total situation. We don't put good governance into one ivory tower and the economy into another. We've discovered in South Africa that they are two sides of the same coin. But today, my colleague and myself will be focusing much more on the economy, but with the implicit assumption that what has been said before is also relevant to getting our economy right. But there are other issues which we need to more narrowly confine to the state of our economy. And in fact, I like to say that the GDP in South Africa is not only the gross domestic product, it's also the gross domestic politics, and as we know, very gross. So we have to accept those are two sides of the same coin. And it's interesting that the challenge of we were originally 4 or 5 who had to be here. Others had, I think, reasons why they couldn't make it. I hope it wasn't because they thought the magnitude of the economic problem is so big, they'd rather not be a party to its solutions. I think if we look back on what was said this morning and elsewhere, I'd like to say that the challenge we are facing, and I'm hoping that we'll move towards what are some of the potential solutions. In other words, what can shift the perceptions that the glass is half empty to the perception that it's half full. And if it's to be half full, then you must have hope that there are solutions in the making, or that solutions can be implemented or should be implemented. And I like to say that really what South Africa has fallen into now, if we take what was said earlier, I'd say we've fallen into 4 traps, which we now have to get out of. The first is the growth trap, the low growth trap, to which there's been some earlier reference. I want to remind some of us that someone referred earlier to the Thabo Mbeki era. By the time we got to 2007, and before the world economy and Eskom put the lights out, we grew at over 5%. And that was the goal of the yet not really implemented National Development Plan, which said in 2012, that's really, if you want to get this situation right in terms of reducing unemployment, of reducing poverty, of narrowing inequality, you've got to get your growth rate up to about 5.5% by 2030. So we've steadily seen a decline in our growth rate since roughly the NDP was published, although the homework was being done earlier, since 2012. Our growth rate has steadily deteriorated, and it's a question of whether also, as I'll come back to in a minute, whether our growth potential has been damaged in this process. We were cheered to hear this morning, or at least yesterday, that after a minus 3.C growth rate in the first quarter of this year, which was due to certain factors, including the Eskom factor, we've rebounded in a way in the second quarter. But just a reminder that that's good news, nothing like a pleasant piece of news for a quarter of the economy. But the forecast still is that given where we've come from and given where we want to go to, the growth rate forecasts for this year is going to be 0.5%, 0.5 or 0.6. You know, we've now got to a point where our mood is triggered off by decimal points. So 0.5, 0.6, you can be less or more cheerful, depending. But we know, what can a country do with 0.5%? Better, it's positive, of course, better than a technical recession, of course. But we know that that's the challenge we face. We've got to get that up to another level. Now, I just want to caution you when I talk about the low growth trap. I'll come back to it in a minute. The National Development Plan, in its mood of optimism in 2012, legitimately thought that if we did the right things, we could get up to 5%. Again, the latest document from the National Treasury, which you will know about, their growth strategy, which really consolidates what we already know hasn't been done but needs to be done. But at the back, people haven't noticed some of the numbers where they've said, well, you do all these things, this is what we can now promise you. Let me just deal with two numbers which are significant to what we've discussed so far this morning. The first is they very realistically say that over the next decade, if we do the right things, we can grow at 2.3% average. A far cry from the promise of the National Development Plan had we implemented it at the time. And secondly, over that period of 8 to 10 years, we could create 1 million jobs. It just puts it into perspective what the growth trap is that we need to break out of. I'm hoping we can do better, but I'm pleased that an official forecast is more realistic and reminds us of what the growth trap is. Then I come to the poverty trap, to which there was reference. I think economic development tells you it's not a sine qua non, but by and large, alleviating poverty is a halfway house to reducing inequality. It doesn't always work that way. China hasn't gone that way. They've been able to do something about poverty, but not so much about inequality. But by and large, the literature, the research says, once you start fixing poverty, you can then start to close the inequality gap. We were starting to do that. The World Bank survey showed that up until roughly 2010, 2011, 2012, we were starting to do quite a bit about absolute poverty in South Africa. We've lost ground since then. It's lost ground as we've identified what is the ground lost in our economy over the last decade or so. So we've got to break out of this poverty trap. The third is the debt trap. In the meantime, as we've heard earlier, we've mismanaged various things. I won't go into it now. The state-owned enterprises, the size of the government's wage bill, all those issues, all those buttons that are pressed in the debate every day. And I think there, what has happened is that we are not in a debt trap, but it's close. The warning signals are there, hence talks about Moody's losing patience with us. Probably they won't downgrade us just yet. They may say, we'll take your outlook from stable to negative. And there's a red light, of course. But the important point is that our Minister of Finance, the Treasury, the Cabinet and the government have to manage public finances so that this country does not fall into a debt trap with all the consequences that would flow from that. So there are remedial steps that have to be taken. Then thirdly, there is, of course, fourthly, the uncertainty trap. Now that's probably the biggest one of all. Because wherever you look, whoever you talk to, government, including our president too, is committed. It is in the nation, it's in the document from the National Treasury, that uncertainty hovers over everything. And here the issue is that when you look back, we've had ample plans. I've written books about the plans, hoping it might inspire their implementation, but I haven't been very successful. We've had a number of plans since 1994, and the problem is we don't stay on message. We spend time in these gatherings talking about them. In fact, I've said often, if we could factor talking into our growth rate, we wouldn't have a problem. And now we've lost a lot of time. It's not just a question of laws not being applied, it's policies and projects not being implemented on a scale to make a difference. Of course, some are, but we wouldn't be where we are now if we had stuck to whatever we had said in, for example, the National Development Plan, which was the most recent one, and implemented it. So what I really want to say, when we come back to where we are now, it's probably a measure of the frustration and the impatience that a key government department has, and the mandate on which the president has been elected to turn this economy around, to implement pro-growth reforms sooner rather than later, that we have this latest plan from the National Treasury, which I think offers an enormous amount. It's not breaking, it may sound new to people who have always opposed what it stands for. That's another matter. but in fact it consolidates a number of things that we said we would do to build this economy, to meet the aspirations of growth and unemployment and inequality, which we have not done. And now we've got an opportunity, because we are wanting to break out of those four traps. This is the most important way we can do it. And once the debate is over on the 15th of September, that we must walk the talk in the mini budget. We must walk the talk at the next investment summit. And we must implement what we've said, so that we use our institutions in the private sector, in government and so forth, to implement what we say we would do in a way that sends a message out there that's going to make a difference. Planning has to stop and action has to start if we really want to turn this economy around and make tangible differences to the numbers that are hurting a lot of people out there.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We'll start with good morning. I'm going to do something very unusual for an economist by training. I'm going to start with some good news. Our job as a profession is to depress people. That's the work of economists. I've got some good news for you, and I'll dish it up in 3 doses. The first piece of good news is we don't need money. South Africa doesn't need money. We've got enough money. The second piece of good news I'll give you is we don't need economic growth. We've probably got enough growth as it stands. And the third piece of good news that I'll give you is we're not Venezuela. Now, let me try and sort of unpack or unravel those 3 sweeping observations. Why would I suggest we don't need money? Because as a middle-income country, as a low middle-income country, as defined by the World Bank, South Africa spends more on healthcare and education as a percentage of GDP than any other middle-income country. So that's not a shortage of money. It's a shortage of impact or effectiveness. And I think Raymond has already made this point. We need to get out of the habit of talking and pointing and suggesting and into the business of doing. So we have, in fact, as much funding, if not more funding, than any other middle-income country to deal with education and healthcare. That takes perhaps some anxiety out of NHI, and it puts wings into the prospect for education reform, starting with early childhood development policies. And I love the fact that the 77-pager of last week flags ECD, because of the places in which the public sector can spend money, the greatest return, the highest impact you get from public purse on education spend is not on nuclear physicists, it's on children. The first 1,000 days. So my good news gets some qualifications. My second piece of good news, that we're not Venezuela. Well, if you followed the history or the story of that country recently, Venezuela has turned into an absolute basket case, wrestling with 1 million% inflation, which bankrupts the middle class. The average adult lost in 2017 15 pounds, about 7 kilograms in body mass, and that wasn't because of banting, that was because of hunger. And a country with a population of 20 million had 100,000 infant deaths in 2018. Absolutely tragic. So this country has gone from the poster child of economic reform and social development to the basket case of economic reform and social development. We are not Venezuela. However, if you're keeping an eye on Latin American news, I would venture that we are Argentina. That we are stuttering and stumbling, that we have turned foot shooting into a national sport, and that we are not too far away from running into a debt trap. How far away? Well, at the risk of being quoted or cited, I would venture about 2 budgets away. that if we run a -5 and a -5 budget, those look like they're on the cards, and you add in the state-owned enterprise debt, South Africa has a 70% debt to GDP ratio, and that puts us in sub-investment grade. So 24 months away. Well, my good news can quickly become bad. But Argentina is not a basket case. Argentina is in need of reform and repair and firm stewardship. What was my third piece of good news? Oh, my third piece of good news was that we don't need growth. Now, this is a little bit more adventurous. Why would I suggest we don't need growth? Because over the first 15 years of the ANC administration, South Africa achieved as an economy some impressive structural reform. And those first 15 years of ANC administration were in fact South Africa's longest, uninterrupted, sustained growth performance in modern history. In other words, that we have on record. Those first 15 years of ANC were the best we've ever had. But when we got to the end of those 15 years, our unemployment rate sat in the 20-something territory. Our income inequality remained the highest in the world, and our our industrial barriers and boundaries were as high as ever. So we had, in many ways, transformed cosmetically, but not intrinsically. And so my point about growth is not that I don't want growth, but it's that growth hasn't brought the cure that it promises. And that what South Africa really needs to square up to is these structural ailments. Now, we've only got half an hour and 2 economists in half an hour. Your chance of achieving consensus, absolutely zero. You can put as many decimal places as you like after that. So let me make just a couple of suggestions about where we could find silver lining. I think there is an urgency for exactly this on the poster behind us or in front of you, nation building. 25 years after the dismantling of apartheid, I mean, I'm thrilled to tell you that I don't live in the country I was born in. The country that I was born in as a white male, the end point for me at 18 years old was conscription, where I was obliged to do one of two things: either go to the border and shoot people for a belief that I had absolutely no conviction in, or I had to leave the country. Actually, there was a third choice. I could go to jail. Those were my choices. And I am thrilled beyond words that that country no longer exists. But the country that I want to live in also doesn't yet exist. And it doesn't yet exist because our walls remain high. And there is no country that has become successful by building walls. Note to Trump. No country has achieved success by building walls. And our country is walled. What do I mean by that? So some examples of walls. A first wall is our social trust and cohesion is amongst the lowest in the world. That as a society, we don't trust each other. That needs to be repaired and remedied. That is not a national imperative. That's a one-to-one imperative. How do we find each other? How do we connect? How do we get to understand each other? Because I bet you, if we talk, you and I have the same ambitions in our hearts. So I think that's one thing that we need to put onto the table. The second is our social mobility remains amongst the lowest in the world. If you are born poor in South Africa, you die poor in South Africa. If you're born in Khayelitsha, you die in Khayelitsha. If you are born in Sandton, you are born into privilege and you are likely to die in privilege. So social mobility is mythical. And that where there are stories of people who have, well, my mom was a domestic worker, I'm the director of a listed company, look at my transformation, that's the exception. It is not remotely close to the rule. So our social walls are high. A third wall that is very high is our industrial walls. Choose an industry at random, and my suspicion is, and I could do like a magician's trick, think of an industry. And you'll have thought of an industry: banking, insurance, logistics. Industry after industry in South Africa is characterized by a small number of large companies. And large companies don't create jobs. So you can have as much growth as you like. It will be led by large businesses that invest capital to feed productivity. It does not spawn new businesses which are labor absorptive. And actually, I've said a lot. So, let me leave those three walls as walls that I think we can all square up to. To go to Raymond's point, and perhaps here we can find quickly common ground, is on the 77-pager of last week, Tito Mbowene's policy. I am delighted with this policy. I think it's the best document to come out of National Treasury in a decade. Not because I agree with everything, but because it represents a squaring up to, I've got an idea, here it is. Let's deal with this. And many parts of that idea disagree with the consensus. That's brave, that's bold. Some people have called it maverick. I can live with that, but it is a clear articulation of, here are my ideas. The second point is it's evidence-based. He hasn't spent afternoons navel gazing and then dreaming up ways in which South Africa can be miraculously rescued from itself. Instead, he has gone to country and industry evidence, and he has drawn that evidence into a clear, compact, articulate document and said, this has worked there, perhaps we should try it here. And he has been adventurous in pointing to experimental policies. We could try this and see if it works. That's pragmatic. Two other elements that I really like about this policy. That it's 77 pages means it's digestible. We can get through it. You might even read it. And the last point about it is it's got timelines. Ellen Sirleaf-Johnson is my hero on this. When she becomes the leader of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf-Johnson put in place 100-day programs. And she said, over the next 100 days, we will achieve these 150 goals. 100 days is unmistakable. It's achievable. We can measure it, and we can put it up on posters, and we can score those victories. I'll make the number up on the spot, but she achieved something like a 97% success rate in those 100-day programs. South Africa needs those victories. And Tito Mbowene's 77-page policy paper points to 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year. And the 10 year, by then, life will have changed. But the 1 year, the immediate, the spectrum, the tourism policy changes, those are immediate and achievable. There are silver linings on this very dark cloud, and they start with us.